Welcome to a brand new podcast. Ian McLean is a writer and the author of TJ's War. David Blair is an actor and the narrator of the audiobook TJ's War. David and Ian have been listening to their readers and listeners and have decided to turn TJ's War into a movie. And since the story covers the entirety of World War II, the movie will cost at least $50 million. Will David and Ian succeed in their quest? Follow them in this podcast series. We're going to make a $50 million movie.
Hello, everyone.
Morning,
Welcome. Welcome. Now, if you've watched this the first time round, apologies. We had a false start. Far too difficult to explain, but you're very welcome to a very different episode of We're Going to Make a $50 million movie. If you're catching us live, then a very special hello to you and thank you for your patience. If you're catching us in the recording, well, the world didn't actually end on the 25th of July, 8 o'clock in the morning, or even...
Although we thought it was, if you watch the outtakes.
David's here.
Morning, everyone. Afternoon, evening, good night.
Yes, and Quinn, as always, is behind the scenes, just like Hugh. David, why don't you tell us a bit about what you're up to?
So today, we thought it would be fun to read a little bit of TJ's War, which I've done once already, the full 23 and a half hours. But to read you a little bit live from the actual book, which incidentally will be quite different to the recording of the audiobook, which was done here, right here in the booth, all of it. Using this easel with a back to it, and I would have the entire script printed off, put here on the easel, because of course sometimes, quite often, sentences go over the page in a book, but we don't want to have page rustling and nasty noises like that happening when we're recording an audiobook. So it either needs to be on an iPad, some digital representation, or a physical script, so that we don't have page noises. But today, just for the purposes of this, more a Jack and Ori style, we're just going to use the book. So bear with me on any stumbles or page rustling or whatever. This is just for the purposes of giving you guys a flavor of the book. And
we are live.
And we are absolutely live. Yeah, as we found out several times already today.
Anything can happen. So we're going to do a lot more of these readings. And
there's no animals or kids here today, I don't think.
And in a different slot from now, so that we continue with our normal podcast content at the usual time, i.e. we'll have another podcast episode at this time next week. But we're doing this because we want anyone who hasn't read the book or listened to the audiobook to get a feel for the style. You see, it's a true story, but it's told as a novel. No historian or researcher can truly know the dialogue between two people in an empty room, or the thoughts of people, or the actions before any of the events that were recorded are down. So these, in each case, are my best guess. I researched my father for 30 years after he died, because I had no idea. I realized I had no idea who he was or what he got up to. I didn't intend to write a book. But then I got to the pandemic, and lots of people were dying. All the people I'd ever interviewed about my father were already dead.
Just on that, when you were 10 when he died.
Yes.
And you had no idea did you even know that he was a soldier, that he was in the war?
It never occurred to me.
Nothing, no clue
Watched lots
whatsoever.
of war films and everything else, but it never occurred to me my father had been involved in it. I just didn't think about it.
And you only knew him as someone that was hopelessly damaged by alcohol.
Correct.
And he used to just disappear every day, go to the pub, come back, totally drunk at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And that was pretty much, not always, but I gather that was pretty much all you knew him as.
Correct. Yeah.
And then you found some, this is, we're sort of doing a very, very brief potted history for anyone that might have missed earlier episodes, but Just
I
to,
didn't expect
this
you
is
to do
just
this much talking.
this is just context. So you went from that, no knowledge, age 10, to starting to discover a few photos, etc., and then did your 30 years
Age
of
15.
research, age
Yeah.
15, and then 30-ish years of research to find out this incredible story.
Yeah. Not continuous 30 years, just roughly a week a year
Yeah.
for 30 years.
Yeah.
But yeah. And I during the pandemic, I realized that it's my job, it's our job as the generation we're at to bridge the gap from the past to the future. So that's why I wrote this book, and I wrote it in a way so that people would begin to understand the feelings and associate themselves with these people, because they're no different. We are no different. In my head, I was just saying a few minutes earlier, I still think I'm 21. We, all of us right around the world, we all have the same wants for our lives. And somehow people think, well, it was a generation that went through the Second World War, they were used to it or something. It's crazy. So that's why I wrote this book. And it's not just about my father, about TJ. There's a whole generation, and we continue to produce generations of great people who are put through ridiculous violence and death for no good reason.
And is it on the cenotaph? I'm not sure, where it says, "Lest we forget."
Lest we forget. Very good point. So I'll be in the background.
So just tee it up,
any questions you have while we're doing this. Yeah,
we're gonna literally start. There is a little kind of introduction before this, but I'm going to start with chapter 1 today. Can you just tee it up, Ian? We're in Norway. Why is TJ in Norway?
Too many words for me.
Okay, there's going to be plenty from me in a minute.
Well, the book goes on to explain why he's in Norway, but just for this chapter, it's 1940. It's March. Most of the British Expeditionary Force have been sent to the Maginot Line in Europe, in France and Belgium, or close to Belgium. But it was realized that the German tanks were being made using armored steel, and the key component for the armored steel is nickel, which was coming from the north of Norway, a place called Kirkenes. So the British sent a force up into the middle of Norway to stop that supply. The Norwegians were basically split on supporting or fighting against the Germans, and the Germans, on realizing that the British had gone into Norway, came out of Poland like a bat out of hell, straight up through Denmark into Norway to take them on. The British were completely unprepared for this type of warfare, and they basically got their backsides kicked. TJ was one of the men who, as a private, he just joined the army, was sent up to Norway. I think that's as much as I want to say, right?
Yeah, excellent.
Just finishing off, I'll be in the background answering any questions you might have during the live recording. Thereafter, it's a recording, so put your comments if you've got questions, and I'll get to them as quickly as I can. David, good luck. Over to you.
Okay, so TJ's War by Ian McLean. Chapter 1, to the beginning. May the 25th, 1940, was not a date John McLean would particularly remember, despite being close to the summit of a Norwegian mountain. The days since early April had merged into a period of intense cold and desperate survival. Tempered steel at -20°C is not kind to human skin. Standard kit provided no protection to his soaking, freezing body, and he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt his feet. The others were equally miserable, perhaps more so. At least he had experienced highland winters from mountain slopes, and plenty of them. These poor buggers were lowlanders or townsfolk. Yet the men walked on, those that were still alive. John's captain was an officer fresh out of training, with all the confidence, arrogance, and belief of the British Empire. The captain had been pushing his men forward since they first landed in Norway 2 months earlier. But this officer had left a trail of frozen bodies in his wake, none of whom belonged to the enemy. These had been men under his command. John guessed the captain would have been around 25 years old, only 6 years older than himself, but they were worlds apart. The small detachment was not big enough to hide the young man from Skye. As opposed to the men on either side of him who had been tending animals, ploughing fields, working in factories, driving buses, selling shoes, John had arrived from university, his studies cut short. The captain sensed John's intelligence, was challenged by it. The officer could see how his men naturally gravitated towards the quiet soldier who seemed to know more about rifles than his own sergeant. "You, McLean!" It was the captain marching down the line of trucks. John, who had been squatting over a paraffin fire, immediately stood to attention. "Sir." "What are you doing, McLean?" "Heating water, sir. Making tea." John looking straight ahead, his voice calm, measured, lacking the urgency of others when addressing the captain. "I did not give anyone permission to light up." He was looking for a fight, leaning into John's face. A range of responses were running through John's mind. He was struggling to cope with the nonsense of his officer. Should he say something? Or just punch him on the nose? John continued to look straight ahead, his mind racing, and then his peripheral vision picked out the sergeant moving towards them. "Captain, a word, please," said the sergeant. The officer pointed at John to stay still, and then moved across to the elderly sergeant so that he would be out of earshot. John knew the sergeant would be explaining that he had ordered John to get a fire going while the other lads refueled the trucks. The captain's lips sharpened. He turned to march back up the convoy while the sergeant made his way across to John. "Carry on, McLean," said the veteran, his voice a lesson in tested tolerance. There was a battle coming. John could see it in the captain's eyes. He could hear it in his tone of voice. The entitled, privileged man-child was going to get John and the rest of the platoon killed before they went much further. The men had not been given additional kit. They wore khaki brown, which made them stick out like flies on icing. There was no waterproofing, no protection. Trucks were canvas covered, and weapons often failed, with parts jamming or just breaking off due to the intense cold. As for the army communications, they had failed before a single foot made shore, saltwater spray only being expected by the Navy. Worst of all was the deep cold of night. Young, inexperienced, exhausted boys had quickly become more afraid of the night than the enemy. Over the first few nights, the captain and sergeant had slept in the cabin of the first truck, while most of the men were left to cope as best they could in canvas-covered trailers, cold, but out of the wind and away from the frozen ground. It wasn't long, however, before the diesel froze and the trucks had to be abandoned. The men were ordered to take as many rations and as much ammunition as they could carry and set off on foot. This was when soldiers started to surrender to the cold. Over the following days, darkness would arrive all too quickly. Tired bodies won battles over fearful minds, and eyes closed. Each morning revealed the men who had succumbed overnight. Sleeping young men became innocent, frozen corpses. So many wasted lives. Yet the captain pushed on, leaving the dead where they lay, the ground too hard to dig graves. John promised himself that he would grieve for them one day, that their names would never be forgotten. But he did forget. He had to. As the sergeant noted their names and locations in his little book, John caught his eye more than once. If only their mothers knew. John left behind these heaps of frozen cloth with angels' faces. He needed to keep going. There had been hints to the lads during training that John could be useful. He was a dead shot with a rifle, and looked the same at the end of a route march as most of them did at the beginning. He wasn't the biggest man in the platoon, But the young Highlander carried himself with the quiet confidence of those who were either foolish or skilled, and no one took John for a fool. So there was no resistance among those still alive when John started to teach them how to survive, how to dig holes in the snow, how to place branches and composted leaves on the floor, to huddle together and rotate sleeping positions so that no one stayed on the outside of the group for the whole night. John's actions did not please the captain, who felt his authority was being usurped. But the sergeant, a survivor of World War I trenches, stayed firmly between them. On the morning of the 25th of May, 1940, the remnant of John's group walked along a ridge above the road connecting Hoylinde and Upler. They had been out of contact with their main unit for over 2 weeks and had not encountered the enemy since April. In fact, they had not directly encountered the enemy since arriving in Norway. Much to their leader's frustration, more than half his men were dead, without a single one of them firing a shot. The fighting had all been carried out by forward units. John's squad always seemed to arrive as the last fires were being put out. Lots of dead people, but no one killed by his squad. That was fine by John. However, things were about to change. A deafening, icy blast of wind cut across them, and yet John could sense that something was about to happen. On reaching a high point, he could see the line of soldiers from his unit stretching out in front of him. Suddenly, the lead man ducked away to one side. The sergeant immediately went down on one knee, holding up his right fist. The men behind threw themselves on the ground. Distant rumbling could be heard from beyond a corner in the road below the ridge. The sergeant crept back through the line. "Menzies, McIver and MacLeod, get up with the captain. Take the Bren and all the straps of ammo. The rest of you spread yourselves along that line." The sergeant pointing to a rim of trees, connected by a knee-high bank just below their path. Getting into position behind a bank of moss and rotting branches, John could hear the increasing clatter from hidden vehicles. Then the first of them came into view at the bend, a German swastika clear on its side. "Wait for it, lads. No one is to fire a shot without my say-so." The sergeant was trying to own it, but he was looking across at the captain, waiting for a signal. "Make sure you have ammo at the ready. Safety catch is off. Easy, lads. Make every shot count." The sergeant was speaking from memory. This would be his first engagement in over 20 years, his phrases coming out like lines from a well-worn poem. Coming further into view, the convoy was made up of 3 German half-track troop carriers. The vehicles were armoured, with rubber-tired wheels at the front for steering, while the main body rested above 10 feet of armoured caterpillar track, ideal for tracking through freezing, snow-covered Norwegian roads. Pointing his rifle at the leading vehicle, John was incredulous at what was about to happen. "They're armoured," he thought. "This is madness." But he knew the captain would not back away. This would be his first engagement. He needed to prove his worth. The front troop carrier came directly beneath John's position. The captain signalled, and the sergeant shouted, "Right, lads, fire!" John, along with the others, did as he was ordered, but he could see it was pointless. Bullets bounced off doors and bodywork. They were having as much impact as moths on lantern glass. The sergeant, too, knew that this was not a sensible course of action. "Keep at it, lads. Keep them guessing. I'm going to have a quick word with the skipper. Don't let them get out of those trucks." The first carrier turned to face the slope, while the other 2 closed the gaps between them. A rear door flew open with Wehrmacht troops emerging like angry wasps from an invaded nest, only the tops of their helmets visible to John's squad. Using cover from the other 2 carriers, German soldiers quickly set up mortar positions, and within seconds, the first shell landed by a tree some 10 feet ahead of the captain's position. There was a short delay before a second mortar round was sent up. This time, the explosion was on point, and it was deafening. Bullets started to fly above John's head, and then the sergeant's arm, complete with torn khaki and chevroned insignia badge, landed on the snow just in front of him. No blood. No time for blood. "Christ! They've got the Sarge!" yelled James.
Brilliant. Thank you, David. That was, every time I hear you read this stuff, I keep thinking to myself, I wonder what happens next.
Me too. And that, dear listener, is why we ended there. So go out, buy your copy, use an Audible token. Go read, go listen. It's an amazing story and brilliantly written. But before we go too far down that road.
That's great. Thank you very much. I hope
Not at all.
you've enjoyed that. I know that we lost a few people because of the restart. So I hope you catch this on the recording. And as I said before, any questions you have at any point, please ask them in the comments and I'll be more than happy to answer. And if you want to jump ahead and find out what happens next, the audiobook is just more of the same. David does a brilliant job. And of course, the book is available from Amazon. The links to the places where you can get hold of these things are in the comments section underneath, or in the notes section underneath the YouTube.
It's not this cover anymore.
It's not that cover anymore. There is
No.
a third version.
So you'll see it on the left of the screen, Ian's right. That is the new cover.
No, that's right. Yes, you're quite right. Just in the bottom right-hand corner, that is the new cover.
The slightly more kind of monochrome version. I don't know whether everyone can see it, but
yeah,
that's the one that you're looking for now.
So here we draw to an end this episode of this very special episode of we're going to make a $50 million movie.
And just to remind the listeners that partly the reason for doing this today was to let people know that we're doing this, reading regularly from the book at a different time. So next week we'll go back to more normal type podcasts. And I think Sunday night we're aiming for, that's to be confirmed, but we're aiming for a live reading Sunday night. So I'll just be reading 10 or 15 minutes, something like that, each week to give people a flavor of the story.
Excellent. Thank you again, David. That was brilliant. Thank you, Quinn. Hope you enjoyed it, everyone.
Have a great day, guys. See you.
To find out more about the book, visit tjswar.com. And to buy it, click on the Amazon link below. To accompany us on our journey, please subscribe to this podcast because we're going to make a $50 million movie.